Welcome to the Performance Psychology Podcast. In this episode, I'm interviewing Dr. Scott Goldman. Scott is an absolute legend within the world of sports psychology and currently works for one of the best basketball teams in America, the Golden State Warriors. His contributions to sports psychology have been unprecedented over the last 15 years. And in this episode, we take a deep dive into the topic of confidence and find out whether it's all it's cracked up to be. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. I'd like to welcome Dr. Scott Goldman to the Performance Psychology Podcast. A huge welcome to you, Scott. It's great to have you on the show.
Oh, thanks. It's an honor to be here.
Scott, would you mind just telling us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So my name is Scott Goldman. I'm a licensed clinical and performance psychologist. I have 2 PhDs. One's in clinical psychology, the other's in school psychology. And then I received advanced training in performance, exercise science, and kinesiology. And so I'm also a certified mental performance consultant from the Association of Applied Sports Psychology. I'd say for about 20 plus years now, I've been working in the elite space with universities like the University of Arizona's athletic department, the University of Michigan's athletic department, but as well as working in the professional space with teams like the Miami Dolphins, the Detroit Lions, the Washington Wizards, and the Golden State Warriors.
And I came across your work actually when I was listening into a chat that you were involved in Clubhouse, kind of the new app that's all the rage at the moment. And you were saying something in particular. The whole topic of conversation was around this idea of confidence and how it helps performance, its relationship to performance. And you started proposing, and I wasn't sure at the time whether you were kind of playing devil's advocate, but you started proposing this kind of counter theory. And would you mind just telling us a little bit more about that as how kind of confidence might be perceived, and then what your thoughts were?
Sure. I mean, I think the thought thread that you are tugging on kind of stems from this study that came out, gosh, man, it's old. I want to say it's now like 20, 30 years ago, where they asked Olympic medal winners, what's the one thing you wish you had more of? And the number one answer was confidence. And I think what's really interesting is these are Olympic medal winners who are asking for more confidence. And so I think sometimes there's a narrative, especially in the world of performance psychology, where we want people to feel confident because we think that comes with or delivers optimal performance. And I'm not so sure that's a universal truth, because a lot of times when we look at that confident to performance relationship, it's often queried with a sort of like post-event analysis. So I think sorry, do you need me to start over there? My dog.
No, absolutely. No, we're all fine. Don't worry.
Okay. So I was just going to say, and I'll put a little space there. So if you need me to edit it. What I was saying is, a lot of times there is an investment in the evaluation process that comes after we know the result. And I think there are people who might tell themselves, yeah, I felt totally good, or I felt really dialed in, or I felt supremely confident because the event played out the way it did. Being on the sidelines on Sundays for the NFL, or being in some other spaces, I've seen players firsthand, and again, this is just anecdotal, where they did not look at all confident, went out there anyways, and performed quite well. And that led me to kind of think a little bit about things like the origin of anxiety. I mean, if you think really about so I'm kind of fascinated by this. Sorry if I'm going on a tangent here, but
so from an evolutionary perspective, you're talking.
Yes. Yeah. Like, I'm fascinated. Like, why does water come out of our eyes when we're sad? Like there is mechanisms from an evolutionary perspective. And so one of them is, okay, well, what's the evolutionary process of anxiety and what's its utility? And I think that there's a lot of merit to it, because in a lot of ways, bringing it back to those sports and performances, it's a readiness state. Like anxiety can be as much about alertness and everything else. It's just we often talk about it with a pejorative label. And then, as you kind of pointed out in our offline conversation, sometimes people will just do like a relabeling, like, oh, hey, biophysiologically, anxiety and excitement look the same. So just tell yourself you're excited, which works. It's a good intervention. But I think there's a step further, which is also just normalize or accept however I feel can be of value. Now, how much I spend time and attention on it, or what I do with that feeling. And I say feeling, I don't just mean emotional, I mean like the physiological feeling, my heart's racing. I think what we do with it is really what matters. And that comes from, really the origin of that stuff comes from rational motive behavior therapy and Albert Ellis, who really talked about it's not the events that dictate outcome, but really what we tell ourselves and how we process that outcome that yields the emotional.
I'll often say to clients, it's very, they seem to look at their anxiety, their performance anxiety. I'm largely working in golf, kind of through this very, contextual on the golf course and this situation and with these people and somebody's watching me, and then I just can't have it. I just need to get rid of this anxiety. If I can just feel more confident, then I can perform. And I just say, well, hold on for a second, because there are times when you pay good money to feel that physiological sensation. When was the last time you went on a theme park ride? What was the last movie that you saw that kind of, you read books that for that feeling, to give you that kind of adrenaline physiological arousal. That kind of slows them down a bit and stops in their tracks, because I think, am I right in thinking that what we're really seeing in the data is it's not so much the experience and the cognitions, the thoughts and feelings that show up, it's more about how we relate to them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then I think the other part of it is, as we're starting to lock down certain variables, like for example, the average offensive lineman in the NFL weighed 100 pounds. 100 pounds. I don't know what that is in stones, so you'll have to forgive my American ignorance. But 100 pounds less 20 years ago than they did today. So it comes to things like nutrition and how to put, like, we're starting to maximize that stuff. So I think what's happening is, as we're getting kind of closer to the bullseye, and as we're tightening our shot scope, I think in some ways we might be letting perfectionism get in the way of process. And what I think is interesting about that kind of mindset is we might be putting too much time and attention in the psychological impact. And so some of the things that I'm kind of watching and observing with a little bit of concern is practitioners who might be taking too much credit for outcome. Like, it's funny when a golfer doesn't perform well or the team loses, I don't see that on the website, but I've seen more than a few practitioners who have no problem like referring to themselves as Super Bowl winning sports psychologists and stuff. And so I think there's this part of it where, as we've locked down these other variables, people are starting to focus on the stuff between the ears, which, don't get me wrong, I've dedicated a lifetime to studying and providing, but I just want to keep it in context that, what we do matters, but we also have to temper it with everything else that impacts everything else.
So is what you're saying that, as we're entering into these arenas, or we have a golf shot that we're about to play that has some meaning to it, we're naturally going to get, because of this evolutionary history, we're naturally going to get this kind of physiological arousal. So that's almost just a given in those situations if you're a normal functioning human being. But what you're saying is that this kind of overemphasizing of how we feel, the confidence, the trying to get rid of anxiety, what would be the alternative to kind of, rather than focusing on this feel good this kind of feel-goodism of, because, you know, feeling confident does feel good, right? But rather
Yeah.
than focusing on this feel-good aspect, what would be the alternative? What would be your kind of suggestion in that situation?
Yeah, so I love that question, and it's a really sophisticated one. So let's go back a step, right? The term con artist came from the idea of confidence artist, right? So I think there is this interesting theme or narrative where people can go, hey, I'm going to make you feel better. First, they take that ownership, they make it that directional, and they're going to say, I'm going to make you feel better. And they can also create a dependent state where it's like, hey, the athlete goes, I need to talk to my guy before I go do my thing. And then it becomes part of their almost like superstitious ritual. And I think that there
So almost like someone seeing a drug dealer?
Maybe. I mean, you know, it is like, I got to get my fix. But I think there is because the nature of our work is so filled with intangibles, I think it becomes something where it's an easy space to be deceptive. And I think the practitioners that I really respect and admire and who I aim to be personally are those that practice empirically validated treatments. And they're good scientists and good practitioners. And they accept the humanity of the individual, and they accept the unsolvable, chaotic nature of the task, which is sport. So now going back to your question specifically, I like, again, taking that scientific approach. And one of the techniques that I think is fairly good at reinforcing that is called the zone of optimal functioning, where what you do is you have the player, the athlete, really be a good scientist for a while. So you tell them to kind of like experiment with different emotional, physiological states. You teach them how to monitor it and record it, and you encourage them to do it as much before an event as after an event. In fact, you could even do multiple touch points. Here's what it's like at practice. Here's what it's like when I woke up this morning. So you're really creating a sense of self-awareness and self-reflection with it. And I try to do both subjective and objective captures. So a subjective capture would be one where it's like, you know, what are some of the thoughts that you're having right now? And an objective capture might be something that's a little bit more concrete, like on a scale of 1 to 100, how ready do you feel right now? So once we start to identify where we're at, then we follow it up with, can you link it to performance? So think about your best performance, think about your worst performance. And again, there's a lot of double and triple asterisks when thinking about something that's already happened, but that's just a start. Then it's followed with, okay, let's track it during live time. The practices this week, games this week, next week, etc. And let's get a body of data. Once we start to get kind of a sweet spot of where things feel right. And again, I keep using the word feel, but I'm not just referencing an emotional state. I'm trying to highlight a physiological state too, and the marriage between those. So you go, gosh, you know, isn't it interesting? We think about superheroes like Tom Brady and Michael Jordan. We just go, oh, like I want to be in their state. I want to be in their zone. And the reality is like, you know, what space Tom Brady has to get into is right for Tom Brady. So it's not right for all quarterbacks. So I think there's this interesting part of it where you go, you know, cricket is different than football, and the positions within cricket and football, like, you know, forwards are different than goalies and midfielders and wingers. And so all of a sudden you go, and then you get into the even more step of minutia, which is like, not all wingers in football are of the same arousal state to perform at their best. So once you tailor it to the individual and you help them get to a place where they go, yeah, like I like to be kind of chill before a match. You go, okay, now let me ask you this question. More often than not, do you find yourself needing to calm yourself down or amp yourself up to get into that state? And what I think is really interesting is most teams take an approach of trying to amp people up before a game. So they'll do highlight videos the night before, which I think is interesting because most of these guys are trying to sleep. Then they'll do like, you know, the locker room before the game, they'll get music as loud as possible, just blaring, and kind of get a dance party. And I think what's really interesting is, you know, some of that stimulation can increase like heart pace and rhythm. So then it becomes, well, do we turn that off? And now it's quiet, and that quiet is uncomfortable. And it's like, or do we put headphones on so people can kind of tailor fit what they want to listen to or engage in? And it's funny because every one of those solutions has its own set of new problems. Like, for example, putting on the headphones can be isolating. So I find as we apply these interventions, especially in an applied world, not a science academic place, as we apply these interventions, we have a new challenge, which is once we put an intervention in play, we're kind of tugging on the strings and the threads that alters everything else. Because if I put on headphones and now all of a sudden the left tackle is going, dude, I feel kind of like isolated and I want to talk to this guy, but he's wearing headphones. Well, now the left tackle is out of a state of optimal.
So there's a real ripple effect.
And everything impacts everything.
Yeah. Is there the kind of the thought that was popping into my head as you were mentioning that is there a potential danger there for if we're kind of trying to target a kind of a specific performance state where we feel that we're optimal, are we then in the danger of when we're not there, we're almost spending a lot of mental time and effort trying to get back there, and then as our attention becomes more internal and self-focused on, I'm feeling really aroused and I'm better when I'm calm and kind of like this, are we then kind of missing out on performance cues and the kind of the games going on? And is there a danger there of setting setting ourselves up for potential more self-focus?
Yeah, so I think the real danger is looking for simple solutions to complex problems. And I think you've highlighted it, right? Because, and this is in the non-athletic world, just in the clinical world, people who have, anxiety disorders or diagnosed with anxiety disorders, one of the things that can happen is they can like run up a flight of stairs, have their heart beating fast and be out of breath, and then misattribute that, am I having a panic attack versus no, I just ran up a flight of stairs. So I think what happens is in the world of science and applied work and where it interweaves, things get complicated. And so I go to the idea of there's a lot of things that are at risk and there's a lot of things that we're messing with. Are we like identifying the source of the anxiety, for example? Is that an ego threat? Like if I lose this game, I'm a loser? Or is it a reality threat? Like if I lose this game, I might get cut. And then my source of income and the way I feed my family has forever been altered from being, say, $1 million a year to now selling insurance at $35,000 a pop. And so I think the thing that I am most mindful about is the complexity of this. Yeah. And I get concerned for athletes who are so invested in optimizing their performance that they are susceptible to looking for any solution. And when they find their success, becomes a misattribution of like wearing lucky socks or eating the same meal or not showering or getting into the zone by doing some kind of, and fill in the blank.
Like a ritual. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking like more device even, like there's a lot of products out there too that kind of sell that stuff.
Yeah. So, and somewhat then ignoring the 30,000 hours of practice and competency that they've developed.
Well, and now I'm going to kind of talk out of both sides of my mouth, which is, you're right. Like you can't ignore that. At the same time, I think there is a space of vulnerability where all of that work can be jeopardized because you can have someone put an earworm that can kind of derail you. I mean, I've worked with some players that have said that, where a coach unintentionally threw something out there at the last second that made them go, wait, what? And so I think I think what's important is, again, everything impacts everything. And what goes on between the ears has a tremendous amount of impact, because I think everything below the neck can be ready, nutrition and fitness and practice and rehearsal and all that. And then the driver can short circuit.
Yeah. It's great hearing you talk about, essentially what I'm hearing is either for, people that are listening is about, finding, and it comes back to evolution, right? It's healthy variation in context. It's selection of what works and then retain it over time. And, in layman's terms, that's figure out through trial and error what works for you, unless you're working with someone who can really, speed up that process. But for me personally, it's kind of interesting because I'm not sure if I've made this distinction to many people, so I'm slightly kind of revealing it on the fly here. But I've pretty much given up as a human being on attempting to feel confident, or attempting to be motivated, or attempting to feel happy. So I'm not saying that I've given up on I'm not saying I've given up on any of those things. I've given up on attempting to feel those things, because I kind of started experiencing this in my own performance, in that, if I'm waiting for motivation to turn up to do the dishes, I'm going to be, those dishes are going to be piled high up at the sink. That day's never going to come. Sure. So I guess I've kind of maybe day by day learning the trick of being able to kind of step up and execute my skills or competencies, not doing the dishes necessarily, but, in kind of other areas. And when those feelings do arise, it's much more of I suppose it's much more of an authentic experience. And again, I somewhat feel that there's a trap there in terms of things like gratitude. Gratitude for me, being grateful, is something that's very, very authentic. It's not something that you can kind of manipulate and artificially instigate. I don't feel like it happens in a genuine way. So yeah, it's interesting. I've really about turned in terms of how I approach delivering my skills and making progress and improving my competencies in other areas, almost through kind of letting go of these attempts to feel good in certain contexts.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it well said? And to me, it's like, isn't it funny? It feels like the smarter we get, the dumber we feel, right? And I think what's really interesting in the world of psychology, generally speaking, but performance even more so, we play with language a lot. We play with language, and we also pursue flavors and fads. So whether it's like mindfulness transitioning to gratitude, transitioning to purposefulness, and that's good stuff, and it's important stuff. And I think the reason why some of these trends become popular is they're effective. But I also think that there's this element where, one of my mentors, a man named Kurt Salzinger, who is the scientist upon all sciences. He was a director of science for the American Psychological Association. Brilliant mind. He used to always tell me and teach me, he said, look, the reality is thoughts are a measurable behavior. And I'm going to say this clearly again. Thoughts are a measurable behavior. However, they can only be measured by the person experiencing them. And I was like, that's interesting. What does that mean? And he said, well, let's say you have a cavity in your tooth. I said, okay, I'm with you. You go to the dentist. The dentist can actually objectively see the hole and measure the hole. I go, right. He goes, but what the dentist cannot do is accurately measure or identify your pain. So he can ask, are you in pain? But that's not a universal. Some people have a higher threshold of pain. He can even ask you to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, which I think is interesting because you see some of these like personality inventories out there now that'll give you a hard number. Like, oh, this person's a 30 on the extrovert scale.
Yeah,
which it's also, it's like based off of what and how.
Yeah, and it's very context dependent.
Yeah. But what's really nice is there are indirect measures of thought. So for example, if I were to ask you to imagine sucking on a lemon, we could measure if your mouth were to salivate or not. Now, it's possible that I asked you to suck on a lemon and you thought about a donkey, and for whatever reason, donkeys cause you to salivate, but it's
Yeah, I
more
hope
often than not that sucking on a lemon or imagining sucking on a lemon is what's inducing the salivic response.
Yeah.
We can also now look at like, and Hap Davis, who's a brilliant, psychologist who did a lot of work with Olympic swimmers. Like Hap Davis used fMRI imaging, fMRI machines to show athletes their performance. So they were lying in those tubes. He had a mirror so they could watch it, and he showed them successful performances and watch what happened in their brains. He showed them unsuccessful performance, like where they failed to qualify for the Olympics, and watched what happened in their brains. So again, they could have been thinking about donkeys while they were watching these things. But what felt pretty consistent was, like, especially during failure, more of the part of the brain associated with emotionality started to light up. And what was interesting was one of his interventions, and brilliant work on his part, was he just said, you know what? Instead of triggering the emotional reaction, almost like a PTSD, but with a lowercase t versus a capital T trauma. He said one of the nice ways to help alleviate that is to simply ask, what was the key element missing? So what's interesting is, in all of life, as we navigate it, we receive stimulus, like going to an arena where we missed a shot, or going to a golf course where maybe we didn't play very well the last time. And maybe we misattribute that failure. Like, you know what, the weather sucked that day. It was windy and rainy. And we just make it like, man, I hate this course. And you'll hear that from people. They're like, there's just something about this course. It's got bad mojo, right? So there's that misattribution where you go, now let's just talk about what was the key element missing. Rather than connecting an emotional tie to it, let's just be, students of the game.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of fascinating research, and what an age we live in, right? To be able to have these kinds of insights and technology to think about having that conversation 40 years ago that said you were mad.
Dude, imagine Descartes. I mean, I'm sure Descartes and his whole mind-body dualism would be like, wait, you have an fMRI machine? It's just a game changer. Talk about living in the wrong century.
I mean, what just popped into my head in terms of when we were kind of discussing the worth of the feel good aspect of this, and you're mentioning kind of the coach, saying something that could just kind of trip people up, where they're just like, oh, what was said? I was kind of, did I hear him right, or whatever it was, right? When I made my European tour debut, what do you think the number one question that friends and family asked me before I teed off? What do you reckon it might have been?
My guess is it would be something along the lines of like, are you ready? But I'd be curious to hear, what was it?
It was, how do you feel?
There it is. Yeah. Right.
And there literally could not have been. I mean, it got to the point, obviously, because it was a big day for me and everything else, and it was really important. I could feel the pressure on myself and the occasion, and so on and so forth. And it got to the point, to be honest with you, I was getting really irritated with being asked that question, because in reality, I think what they were asking me, or what I felt they were asking me, or what they were nervous about possibly, was that if I didn't feel confident, or if they kind of asked me and then they could kind of pick it up in my response, that I wasn't feeling confident, then that would somehow, my performance would just be in the can. It would just be gone. If I responded and said, oh, I'm really nervous, I'm worried about, I'm having these thoughts of, what if I mess this up? Which of course I was having. I was being bombarded by them. But I did have, for the time, maybe enough attentional flexibility to kind of get somewhat back on the task. It was probably more my level of skill or competency that didn't put me up into the high levels of the tournament. But it was kind of interesting at how, how destructive that question was in getting me very, very focused on, and that would change from, almost second to second in terms of these waves of, oh, now I'm feeling a bit better. Yeah, I'm kind of thinking, oh, now, boom, gone back down again. And I was just like, this isn't a sustainable kind of way to be. So I suppose in hindsight, if I could have whispered in my own ear, in the build up to the tournament, it would have been about learning those skills to kind of back up a little bit and, train in ways where I was far more accepting of kind of, just keep coming back to the task, keep coming back, focusing on, what helps you to perform, whether it be a swing cue or a task cue or a target cue, whatever it was, and learning to do those things in kind of all types of different situations. And I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts on this, actually, because I've been kind of experimenting and exploring. I like to kind of come up with these little experiential exercises. So for the last 3 months, basically, I've been taking ice showers. So it's been kind of winter over here. And, when you get the water from the ground, I can tell you it's freezing, absolutely freezing. So I kind of first started exploring, warm shower first, and then flip on freezing cold, and just, getting that real physiological, man, you get that adrenaline absolutely courses, and you get the heart rate, and you're getting these thoughts of get out, kind of run out of this thing or turn it off or whatever. So, there's quite a lot of chatter there as well. And I was doing this kind of for the purpose of developing attentional flexibility. Could I kind of have that very aversive experience that felt incredibly uncomfortable, but kind of move my attention around to different areas? And, as I trained this over days and weeks, I kind of found, interestingly, actually, the thing that really made a difference for me was when I brought values into it. So when I started actually doing, started to attending to things that were important to me, like self-care, so washing myself and so on and so forth, and really starting to focus on those things, actually the uncomfortable experience, that very aversive, I've got to get out of here, this is horrendous, it was just less dominant over my attention.
So got a couple of thoughts, but we got to go back a couple clicks. Let's start with, all these people asking you this question, how do you feel? How do you feel? So one of the things that I'll do with athletes is I ask them, what do you think the intention is of the person asking you that question? Because clearly it's triggering your own thoughts about how you feel, but what do you think their intention is? And sometimes they're like, well, what do you mean? I go, well, let's think about what are all the possible intentions of asking a question. Some people, it's because they genuinely care about you and they love about you. So it's a sign of affection, right? Which changes.
It would have been that one. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure for some, but I think others, they do it because they want to insert themselves into the narrative. It's the idea of like stolen valor or, hitching your wagon. So like I saw this a lot when I'm on Sundays at the NFL games, is like a player fumbles the ball, comes to the sidelines, throws his helmet. Then all of a sudden you have 20 different people, players, coaches, staff members who all want to kind of like put their arm around the guy and say the thing that kind of gets them to. And it was interesting because I remember this happened once with a player and I didn't go over there. And another player saw that I didn't go over there and they said, Doc, like you're the sports psychologist. Why aren't you going over there? You just fumbled the ball. We might lose the game, all that. And I go, look at how many people are in his ear. Like, I think sometimes there's actually a really good intervention is leaving a dude alone.
Yeah.
So, so I just said at this point, I'm observing this behavior and I'm going, I think the intention for some, like a teammate who really cared about the guy or the position coach, it was this notion of like, man, I feel bad for this guy. I want to get him back on track and refocus. But then there were other people who I knew had an agenda that was so that they could say, hey, he fumbled. I told him this. He went back out there and did that. And yay me. And I just think that's something to note, right?
Yeah.
So, going back to it is, what's the intention? Is it because they care about you? Is it because they want to insert their own narrative? Or is it also just like they're alleviating boredom or the tension of the awkwardness of like, we're just sitting around waiting for this thing. So, like, how you doing? I don't know, I'm good. How you doing? But then you also brought up a really interesting concept, which I've heard debated a lot. And what's interesting was it used to be debated as a gender factor, but I think they've dialed this way down, and rightfully so, because I'm not so sure it's a gender factor, but it becomes a thing about, do you need to feel good in order to play good, or do you need to be able to play good in order to feel good? That somehow there is this direction. And I think this is something you were getting at too earlier, and bringing it back to now your ice showers, which is, I'm not so sure there's as much of a link between feeling good and playing good as we might want it to be. So now let's talk, and we'll all back that statement up with your ice shower. If you look at some of the literature that comes from acceptance and commitment therapy, they have found when they put people in uncomfortable scenarios, like sitting in an ice bath, that if they practice good ACT type interventions, they will report the sensation of the discomfort higher than those that are not engaged in those interventions. So it's like, wow, they're really feeling it, and they're feeling it more, but they'll also tolerate the discomfort longer. So, I think what's interesting with your ice shower challenge is you're kind of playing with, how can I tolerate discomfort, which is a really effective tool for performance, given a lot of performance involves a great deal of discomfort. What's interesting is what strategies you use. Science has suggested some are better fits than others in that moment.
Yeah, and probably the word for me is willingness. It really feels like my willingness has gone up. And it kind of almost feels, to me, like a bit of a superpower, in that I know that's kind of a very kind of ego-based thing to say, and it's we've got to be careful with that, I know, but it's almost more like I'm kind of stood I still play some kind of somewhat elite golf, so it's interesting to kind of now try these things out, and having built these different mental competencies now compared to how I know I used to, it feels like having developed some of these mental competencies and willingness has gone up, and I've really clarified what's important to me, the values and so on and so forth, developed some attentional flexibility. It kind of feels like I'm maybe stood on the tee or the 18th and I've got a chance to win. And it's almost like I can have so many more different experiences, emotions and thoughts and self-doubt and fear and, intrusive thoughts of failure, like, what if I miss the, it feels like I can kind of have those experiences, but still have the skill to get my torch beam back to where it can. So my question now is, like, very much in line with your statement, is, am I playing to feel good, or am I less interested in feeling good and I'm more interested in playing well? Because I think if people would only play to feel good, then they're probably a lot of people are going to give up the game, because there's, as you said, there's so many situations where you're just not going to feel good.
Well, and golf's a great example, right? Because you can have 66 people at the tournament, and you could play your best round of golf and still lose because you've got 65 opponents, and one of them, all you need is one to have sort of like an abnormal, ultimate superior, like three standard deviations before their norm. So, it's interesting, right? Because, and sorry, the psychologist in me can't let go of when you go, hey, I got to be careful about ego. Like, you know what? Own, be true to you. Like, if your willingness is a superpower, or you feel a sense of pride about your willingness, like, I think that's an important thing to hold on to. So I think something that you tapped into is this sort of secondary process, which is somewhat uniquely human, right? Which is, we have the ability to think about our own thoughts, this sort of metacognition, and we run the risk of judging them, right? So one thing I always do is I say, look, man, like, and this actually kind of comes from suicide literature. If you've ever worked with someone who's suicidal and you ask them, because you have the opportunity. If you're working with them, it means they did not successfully complete the attempt, or they didn't do the attempt. And so you go, okay, well, what stopped you? And having done some of that work, you get a wide variety of answers. And I remember there was a woman I was working with, and she said, I know this is going to sound stupid, but I didn't know who was going to water my plants.
Yeah.
So you can sit there and kind of laugh at that or joke about it and ridicule her, or oh, that's so stupid, or wow, you're so lonely, you have no friends. All you got is, like, you can do all that stuff, or you can go, wait a minute, I bet your plants are really important to you.
Yeah.
That's what stopped you. Like, please tell me about your plants. And so similarly, when you go, I'm really proud of the fact that I'm testing my will to compete, that part of what is generating me to take an athletic process is the idea of the challenge of how far can I throw a rock? Which, again, going back to the evolutionary, you can go, maybe that's the origin of sport, as this sort of like personal challenge.
Absolutely, yeah.
How far can I throw a rock? Well, then I think there's something.
I mean, I'd see great parallels with. I think I even mentioned it to somebody the other day. Actually, just seeing great parallels in terms of, just like this yearning for competence, which and competition. It drives skill development. If you watch two lion cubs playing on a dad lion's back, and the dad lion's getting really pissed off, right? But the lion cubs are playing and fighting, and it's gives them such an evolutionary advantage if they can develop competency. So again, coming back to evolutionary history, I just see that's such a key yearning within us, and maybe more. I was going to say more so men, but that's probably just completely the wrong thing to say in this day and age. But maybe just from an evolutionary perspective, there's certainly going to be advantage there for males to develop skills and competencies that involve some kind of competitive kind of edge to them, right?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that kind of resonates for me, but this is more me personally, like, I don't think this is a universal truth or anything, but I think there is an interesting element to humanity. I think there's a lot of species on this planet that have this. It's not unique to human beings, but I think there's something about the desire and need to be curious and to explore. So sometimes I'll talk with athletes and I'll say, like, we're the only species to make it to the moon. And I think part of that kind of comes from this statement of, gosh, I wonder what it's like to be on the moon. And so one of the things that I think works for me is just to be curious.
Yeah.
So rather than judging it as positive or negative, and that kind of folds into the whole ACT theory and RABT theory. And it's like, I'm just going like, aren't you just kind of curious what's going to happen? Like, there are times right before a moment, instead of asking, hey, how are you feeling? Are you ready? I just go, hey, what are you curious about today? Like, what are you curious about's going to happen? And they might say, like, I'm curious, I'm going to get lit up. I'm curious if I'm going to score 5 touchdowns. It's like, cool, let's go find out, And so going back to sort of like what's becoming popular right now and what kind of taps into the curiosity stuff is, I think people are really starting to look at purposefulness, motivation, drivers, like those are the languages. And it's not a new concept. It's just being talked about. So, you've got like Sam Sinek's Know Your Why kind of stuff, which is really brilliant literature. And Michael Gervais and his Finding Mastery is really kind of tapping into purposefulness and meaningfulness, which I think is really spot on. I kind of add to that dialogue, especially when I'm talking with coaches, where I say, what's really interesting is one of the fundamental tests in psychology is getting mice to press a lever to eat cheese. Like, that was groundbreaking back in the early 1900s, right? Like, wow, we can train mice to press levers, and we can teach pigeons to play ping pong and like all these things. And that's right. 100%, right? And behaviorism. And I said, the thing that I think is so fascinating that you do not see in a lot of the literature, especially about behavioral theory, is that it doesn't matter how well you train the mouse to press the lever, they will not do it until they're hungry. So what's funny is we often focus on what's their cheese. And I'm going, I think it's really about when are they hungry, and what, and that hunger is not so much like knowing their why or knowing their drive, but kind of recognizing some of that. So again, you going with, man, like I kind of want to see how much pain discomfort I can tolerate, because I think that'll make it more universal. I think that's more the cheese than it is the hunger. So I kind of go, well, let's go one step further. And you don't have to answer this, but just for the sake of using you in this situation as an example, why do you want to tolerate more discomfort?
I think I probably know, and I'd be very happy to share. Actually, I think it's just, I think it's very much in line with things that I care about, which is exploring, being curious, and developing competency. So I think from my point of view, it's about the kind of developing the attentional flexibility, being able to, what I call my mental torch beam, being able to move my torch beam around, in a situation that's the stimuli are really crying out for my attention, but I'm still able to just kind of nudge it over here and nudge it over there, and kind of knowing that, there's a pretty good chance that these skills are going to transfer. This is going to pay off. So I think maybe there's a part of that that feels like a kindness to future self. If I'm kind of doing something here, it's really going to help me later on. So when I'm on the 18th tee and pardon?
It's an investment.
Yeah, feels like
you're putting chips in the bank.
Yeah, kind of feels like that. But also at the time, it's not just like I'm white knuckling it. It's not like I'm going through the pain, although it actually is quite painful. But it's more that, in a weird way, it becomes quite an interesting process. So I think there's a playfulness to it, actually. And funny enough, since then, because I've mentioned it to a couple of clinical psychologist friends that I speak to every so often, and they said, oh yeah, it's kind of brilliant, but by the way, there's a much easier way of doing it, and it's holding an ice cube. That's the one that they classically do.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, that is actually, because not many people are going to be willing to jump into an ice shower, particularly when it's kind of near 0 degrees. But yeah, it's been an interesting kind of 3-4 months of doing it.
I think the fact that you're playing with it is really fun. That's pretty neat.
Yeah. Well, we're kind of, once we all open up again over here, we're still in lockdown, but once it all opens up and I play some tournaments this year, obviously I'll have a bit of I'll come back to you and let you know kind of how it's gone.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Today's been an absolutely fantastic chat, and I was desperate to get you on after hearing you kind of talk about confidence in the way you did. It's just been a wonderful insight. So thank you so much for your expertise and your time, Scott. If anyone would like to follow you or kind of know a bit more, do you have anything out there that could be useful for people?
It's funny, like, this probably makes me sound like the old man sitting on the porch yelling at the kids to get off my lawn or whatever, but I don't really have much of a social media presence. Like I don't have a podcast or anything. I think I have a Twitter account, but I don't know what it is. I'm not on it a whole lot. I've got a LinkedIn account, but same. I think if someone wanted to reach me, they could easily just shoot me an email, which is just my last name, Goldman @athleticintel.com. I mean, something we didn't talk about, maybe it's for another conversation, but I created a test that measures sport-specific intelligence called the AIQ. And if you go to that website, Athletic Intelligence Measures, I think the website's athleticintel.com, you can contact me through that contact page. That's another one.
Yeah, fantastic. And yeah, I know that measure, and it's been pretty well used worldwide, isn't it?
Yeah, it's been kind of exciting. I think we stumbled onto something good there.
Fantastic. Yeah, great work. And it's been, just as I said, a real pleasure having you on, Scott. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. And yeah, all the best in the season coming up.
Thank you. Really appreciate it and really enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully we help some people too.
Thank you, Scott.
All right.